What's going on, everybody? This is Fry. So today we're going to be talking about racism. First, we're going to be talking about the definition of racism, and it's been super misconstrued. There are all of these newfound neo-definitions of racism, which are actually bad and actually really take away from the problem of what racism is and how we're actually going to solve this bad issue. So we're going to be talking about what is the definition and what is not the definition. We're going to then talk about in part two is why are people racist? There's actually a biological and sociological reason why people are racist in the first place. Part three, we're going to be talking about how that biology and that sociology has evolved into racist ideology, why people actually think it's okay to be racist. We're going to get into the KKK and the Nazis and all those people and really try to understand what in the world, where are they actually coming from? Part four, we're going to be talking about then about the ideology of why it's not good to be racist. Now, I always try to take the side first that I agree with, less that I disagree with. So that's why I'm first going to be explaining what is the pro-racist ideology. Then I'm going to come and explain why I think the anti-racist ideology is actually the correct one. And part five, we're going to be talking about how to actually solve the problem of racism. It's not going to be yelling, you're a racist, you're a racist. We're actually going to try to talk about how to educate people in terms of recognizing what are the different types of racism and how to actually solve the problem and get rid of the discrimination that exists in, let's say, every society, most societies. So let's just get right into it. Now, before I begin, a lot of you are probably wondering, Fry, how come you're trying to at all to understand why people are racist? You should just be anti. You shouldn't be trying to understand. You shouldn't be giving any sort of validation to racist ideology and explaining biologically why people are racist. And I think that is a huge mistake. Because first of all, you can only be 100% sure of yourself that you are right when you understand fully what is the opposing opinion. If a person, for example, believes anything and does not even consider that they're wrong, they'll be 100% sure about anything, even the worst opinion in the world. Even if you think that it's okay, let's say a person thinks it's okay to go around murdering people, and they've never ever considered in their entire life that it's bad to murder people. What are the chances they're going to think it's okay to murder people? 100%. So it's the same thing about anything. When it comes to, let's say, what we're talking about now, about being anti-racist, that racism is bad, until you've actually considered and understand why people think it is okay to be racist, you're actually not credible. Your opinion is actually not rooted in as much. You're really just coming from a closed-minded place, and it's not as credible. So that's why that's why we're going to try to understand where the other people are coming from. But also, if you're really the answer at the end of the day, and I'm skipping to the part 5, I'm going to explain this at the end of the video, is that really the answer at the end of the day is going to be educating people, involving racist people in the conversation, and showing them, according to what they believe, why being racist is wrong. And you have to, in order to educate someone, first understand where they're coming from. Because if you do not understand where a person is coming from, there's no way you're going to be able to convince them that their ideology is wrong. All right, so let's get first into part 1, defining racism. And I really like the definition of the Oxford Dictionary. This is something that I can find. You can just go to Google and type in the word just racism definition, and you can find this from the Oxford Dictionary. And the definition of racism is, it's a noun. It's prejudice. It says 3 things. Prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now, that is a really good definition. I'm going to explain exactly why. It involves, first of all, 3 different things, which are the 3 different types of racism, and it also describes what the intention, what is sort of the ideology behind what the person has either said or done in order to make them actually racist. Now, the 3 things that it said are prejudice. So prejudice means, the definition of prejudice, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, is when you look at someone differently, you basically have created already some presumptions about the person let's say in this case, which are negative, about the person based on, in this case, their race. Before you've even met them, before you've even heard what they have to say, before you even know them, you've already decided certain things about them. That's what a prejudice is. It's a prejudice. You've already decided before meeting them. Discrimination means treating them unfairly. So that is actually where you are doing something in order to treat people of a certain race differently, and discrimination means in a negative way than other people. And the third thing is antagonism, which is basically berating them, insulting them, putting them down, provoking them, doing anything which you are basically attacking someone of a different race. In belief, and all of these things have to be, again, in belief that your race is superior to yours, superior to theirs. I'm going to get into now to the second definition of racism. And this is this sort of very new sort of definition that, in my opinion, is very harmful. According to the Oxford's Learner's Dictionary. So again, this is a much more basic, this is the Learner's Dictionary, I think. I don't know much about it, but I think it is in order to help people who are just learning English, or to help kids, basically to be breaking a complicated definition down into simple terms. The way they define it is the unfair treatment of people who belong to a different race, violent behavior towards them. I'm going to explain to you right now why this definition really sucks, because it doesn't include, the definition of the Oxford Learner's Dictionary does not say that the basis of that discrimination, of that unfair treatment, needs to be based on the ideology that your race is superior to yours. All you need is unfair treatment of someone who happens to be of a different race. According to that definition, if you cut someone off in traffic and you don't even know what race they are, you only see their car, they have a Honda Civic, yeah? And you cut them off, and it turns out that that person is of a different race than you, then by you cutting them off, you're racist, because you did unfair treatment, you did something unfair, you did something inconsiderate to them. To someone of a different race. If you go and for example, if you have a bunch of employees and you really only have one spot that you need to fill, you can only hire one employee, and there's 10 of them that are applying to the position. If you go and you choose the one that is your race, and you don't hire purposely the one of a different race, you're a racist. Because it's not fair. You're treating the people differently. There's 10 applicants. There's only one that you're favoring, and you're disfavoring the other ones. And if any of those other 9 are of a different race, you're a racist. This really makes the word racist completely diluted. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being racist anymore, according to that definition, according to that wrong definition, that racism just means doing something unfair to someone of a different race, because there's nothing wrong with being unfair to someone who happens to be of a different race, as long as that is not your intention. If you're discriminating, your discrimination towards them is based on their race, then very likely that is something wrong. But if you are discriminating if you're just being unfair to them for other reasons, for completely unrelated reasons to race, but they just happen to be of a different race, there is nothing wrong with that at all. You should actually, the best way, and we're going to get to this in part 5, is that the absolute solution to racism is for you to actually totally disregard the race of the person. You should be judging them by the contents of their character and not by the color of their skin, as the great Martin Luther King has said. So that's the reason why this new neo-definition, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some places that people really are misusing the word racism. And again, it is such a detriment to the entire anti-racist movement, because for a number of reasons, I'll explain that. I'm going to give a really current event example, and that is a reporter who came to Donald Trump. It was in the White House conference, and this reporter said, how come Donald Trump, how come you are calling the coronavirus, that's what we're struggling now at the time of the recording of this podcast, how come you call the coronavirus the Chinese virus or the Chinese flu? That's racist. This is a really, really, really bad use of the word racist, and it really takes away again from when we're going to be calling out people on genuine racism. Because again, calling the coronavirus the Chinese flu does not in any way imply at all that Chinese people are inferior. It's not based on the fact that your race is better than theirs. It is implying that they are to blame. It's saying this originated in China and it's to blame. And you can really give genuine criticism. Don't take this as me defending Donald Trump here for calling it the Chinese flu. I'm sure he has his reason for doing it, but I think there is some really legitimate criticism for calling it that. The reason is because if you call something the Chinese flu, you are basically implying, and this is not a stretch of the imagination at all, you are implying that the flu is the fault of China. It's the fault of Chinese people. And really what has happened as a result of people calling it the Chinese flu, or really just a result of the pandemic in general, is there's been a lot of discrimination against Chinese people, against innocent Chinese people. Even they're like American citizens. Like literally, they're not even they haven't been to China since this whole thing has started. But just the fact that they're Chinese and people sort of, blame China for this. They blame Chinese people. There's discrimination happening. There has been hate crimes that have been happening against Chinese people, which is not okay. And you can certainly make the argument that instead of calling it coronavirus, a COVID-19, calling it the Chinese flu will definitely make those sorts of discriminations, those bad acts against innocent Chinese people, it will intensify them and make them more frequent more often. That is the real criticism against Donald Trump, but it certainly is wrong to call him racist in this case because of this thing. And I'm going to explain now exactly why it is wrong. You'll say, Fry, well, what's the problem? You're saying they got the point across. Yeah, they understand it's not really racist, it's xenophobic, so, you shouldn't be so literal, Fry. Why are you being so literal? Why should we only use the word racist when someone is actually being racist by the dictionary definition, that they're actually claiming racial superiority? I'll tell you the reason why. There's two main reasons why. First of all, is that if you call a person a racist when they're actually not being racist by the definition, there's actually a different criticism, it's so easy to deflect. When that reporter asked Donald Trump and said, hey, you're being racist by calling a Chinese flu, he said, no, I'm not being racist at all. And you know what? He was right. He was 100% right. He's, by the dictionary definition, he's not being racist. If the reporter would have said, just what would you say to all the innocent Chinese people who are being discriminated against based on the flu, based on calling you calling this thing the Chinese flu, then his answer would be, what would his answer be? Worst case scenario, his answer would be, well, I didn't intend that anyone should be discriminating against Chinese people. And that's actually a very good message to put out, that even though he has some agenda of calling it the Chinese flu, Donald Trump really actually, I'm sure he believes that there should be no acts of discrimination against Chinese people because of this. And that's the worst case scenario, is that he just deflects and says, that wasn't my intention at all. But it gets it out there that you shouldn't be discriminating against Chinese people. The best case scenario is if Donald Trump was the person who would actually be more careful about the kinds of things he would say. He would actually say, well, look at the ramifications, even though he's being accurate, it came from China, theoretically. He would actually say, well, out of consideration for Chinese people who are innocent, who have nothing to do with the spread of this virus, who are experiencing discrimination, I'm going to choose not to use the term Chinese virus. That would be the best case scenario. But either way, using the term racism there is really the wrong thing. You should be very clear when you're criticizing someone, particularly when you're criticizing someone. Be very clear exactly what you're criticizing about. And throwing around the word racist willy-nilly makes racism mean nothing. It really dilutes the definition. There's another problem, too, with throwing around the word racism in places where it's not appropriate. And it's because if you go and you just call you call someone who says Chinese flu racist, or someone who makes a racially insensitive joke, and I'm going to talk about in just a second what the difference is between actually being racist and being insensitive towards a race of people. If you go and you start calling everyone a racist down to a person who literally just like makes a joke and really isn't racist at all, you're using your credibility to actually call people out on actually being racist has been completely negated, because you're the person who calls the Chinese flu, who calls that being racist too. So when you actually find a person who's an actual white supremacist and you call them out on being racist, your credibility has gone lower. The word racist is being so overused that when it is actually appropriate, it's not being taken seriously. And that is really the problem with hyperbole. Especially when it comes to giving people criticism inaccurately. Just throwing around words really takes away from the times where that word is appropriate to give someone criticism. I want to talk about a little bit between the difference again between being racist and being insensitive towards a race. Now, first of all, Chinese flu, let's get that out of the way, because Chinese people is not a race. Chinese is not a race. If a person goes and says, well, if a person says Chinese flu, they're talking about East Asians, and you're reducing the word Chinese to East Asians, that is actually a very racist thing to say. To say that Chinese means East Asian. If you think all Chinese people are just your generic East Asians, that's really, if that's not pure racism, that's really, really close to being racist, okay? Chinese people are different than Japanese people. They're different than Filipinos, different than Thailand and Vietnamese people. It's very, very different things. So don't say that Chinese is a race. Maybe it's xenophobic because you're basically creating fear towards people of a different country. And I think that is probably a xenophobic thing. I think it's legitimate to call someone who says Chinese flu, to call that xenophobic. I think it's a legitimate criticism. Let's say a person makes a joke that let's say a person even says a racial slur. Let's say a person even says a really explicit racial slur. A person says the N-word. So it depends. If the person is saying it in a hateful way, if they're saying it in a degrading way, then it really does fit the definition of racism. Because again, our definition of racism is antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that their race is superior. So if you're calling someone an N-word because you think that they are lesser than you, then then the saying of the word is racism. But if a person says it and it's very clear from let's say you're saying it as a joke, and it's very clear from the context that they don't believe that race is lower. They're just saying it as a joke. Now, it doesn't mean it's right, but it's not racism, because racism has to be if it's based on the belief that race is lower. It is, though, racial insensitivity, and we should really not use the word racist there, because again, we have to reserve, as I explained before, the word racism to the people who are actually ideologically believe that a race is inferior. It is insensitive, and it doesn't make it right. I'm not trying to justify now everyone should be able to say the N-word and be able to say all the racial slurs in the world. There's a lot of them. It is insensitive towards the people, but again, it is not. You should say it that way, and you should call them out. You should go and say, that's really insensitive. Now, why is saying the N-word? Why is that insensitive? If a person is just saying it as a joke, why is that wrong? Why is that insensitive? Because there's been a long history of people who are actually racist. The reason is because there's been a long history of people who are actually racist, who actually believe that in the case of the N-word, that black people, let's say, are inferior to white people, and have used the N-word to describe that. And therefore, it does have a connotation. It has this little bit of a reminder, so to speak, of this sort of really actual racist ideology that goes along with it. And that's why it's offensive. That's why it's insensitive to use that word when you're around someone who that racial slur could theoretically be used against in an actual racist way. It's insensitive. And again, this will apply across, using the N-word as an example, but this really does apply across the board to any racial slur. So, but a person who merely, let's say you have a comedian who merely goes on stage and as a joke makes a joke about that the premise of the joke is something is a racial stereotype, but he makes it clear, and let's not confuse it. You can have a comedian goes on stage and they're actually racist, but let's say the person, for argument's sake, makes it clear that they don't actually think that racial stereotype is necessarily true. They're just finding the irony in it. So that is certainly not racism. You can argue that it's racial insensitivity, but again, this is now a matter of sensitivity. And you could also make the argument very strongly that for sensitivity should not limit people's freedom of speech. So it really is a balance. It doesn't mean that you should be able to go around and be completely insensitive to people in all contexts, but also doesn't mean that we need to be super, super scared and never ever make even a slight reference, even humorously, to something which is a racial stereotype because it's super, super sensitive. There has to be some kind of balance when it comes to sensitivity. And certainly all of this thing about racial slur, if it's not coming from a genuine place of race, of actually believing that, again, one race is superior to another, it certainly does not fall into the category of racism. Part 2. Why are people racist? And there is going to be a biological and sociological reason for why people naturally are racist. So let's get first into the biological reason. We have, and you can find this in almost every species of mammal and probably every species of animal actually of life in the world, is that we have an association that something that we observe that looks different than us, we consider that to be a possible threat. And you find this really with everything. If you have, let's say, squirrels, if they see something that looks different, they go and they see a fox, they go and they run away. They're scared. They're very scared of the thing that looks different. They see a fellow squirrel, that's part of their tribe. That's part of their family. They grew up around other squirrels. They had brothers and sisters. They had parents that looked like that. Then they're going to say, oh, that's one of me. That's not a potential threat. This is definitely a biological thing that we differentiate between those that look like us and those that look unfamiliar. And this is really the biological source of racism, is that if a person grows up, let's say, in a family of a certain color of skin, and you all of a sudden are exposed to someone of a different color skin, it's a natural instinct to be afraid, to consider that person to be a threat until proven otherwise, which, as opposed to if they would see someone who did look familiar, looked the way that they do, had, someone that they considered to be the same as them, they would actually presume that the person is not a threat until they actually perceive something specifically that the person is a threat. There is a sociological phenomena that sort of results from that. We are actually very naturally selected to be tribal. Is that, for many thousands, probably millions of years, human beings have sort of gathered into tribes, into having this is one of us. These are the people that, let's say in caveman days, these are the people that live in our cave. These are our people. We're going to cooperate with them. We're going to hunt together. We're going to mate with these people. We're all going to be sort of this one group, and everyone who's outside of it is a threat. And this is different than the biological reason, because this really applies equally between someone else who's a different race and someone else who is even the same race. I mean, you can literally have two tribes of cavemen and they're both exactly the same race. I mean, they have the exact same complexion. They would sort of have this fear of someone who is in a different tribe, who's not one of us. I'm not trying to say that this is bad. We're not going to try, when we solve racism, to fight this instinct, to go and say, oh, this instinct is wrong, and we really need to not feel fear from the unfamiliar. The fear of the unfamiliar is actually something that keeps us safe, and that's the reason why most human beings, and really every animal, really has this of the fear of something strange, unfamiliar. You go and you're scared of it, is because it's a really part of natural selection. The people in evolution, in Darwinism, over the generations who have had this fear have survived more often than those who didn't. And that's why natural selection has really selected that. What we're going to really talk about in part 5 is how to solve racism, is how to use our intellect to overcome these natural instincts we have. The same way we have a natural instinct to, if someone bothers us, to kill them, and we use our intellect to go and say, hey, it's really bad for everyone if we're going and killing each other, every single person that annoys us. We're going to really apply that sort of same logic to racism, and using our intelligent minds to decide what we're going to do instead of using our natural instincts, which is really how all progress is made, all science is made, and really how our society, even voting, even creating a government, creating a society, creating services, getting along with each other, not killing each other. That's really how we've accomplished everything in society, and that's really going to be the answer to racism too. All right, so we've explained why biologically and sociologically people are racist. So now let's talk about in part 3, what is the actual ideology of pro-racist? Now we're going to get into the KKK, the white supremacists, Nazis, there's been actual ideologies, these real big ideas. And it's been a lot of brainwash of people propagating, like the Nazis did, that there is one superior race, one race which is superior to the others. So it's going to be hard to really find a real reasonable way of explaining why one race is superior to another. I mean, it could be a person, if a certain race, let's say, has certain values, and they say these are valuable, and those values, let's say statistically, are more prevalent in their race than of another person. Again, you can actually divide races statistically and say, well, white people excel in this thing, and Asian people excel in this thing, and black people excel in this thing. It is possible to do that statistically. A person could derive from that differentiation, statistical differentiation, that their race is superior. That's what the Nazis did, is they considered the Aryan race. I don't even know what the definition of Aryan is. You can let me know in the comment section below. But they're Aryan, so it's basically white non-Jews, basically, something like that. White non-Jews is the superior race. So one reason why that ideology actually came about, again, it came from this biological instinct. It came from this feeling of like, well, Jews are not us. It also came from this sort of threat, like there is an instinct that a person, let's say a tribe, if you have we're going back to caveman days, and if there's all the different tribes of the cavemen, that they sort of want their tribe to be superior to the others. They want to have rights to the animals, to hunting, to have rights to the land, to be able to spread out, to be able to have the best caves, to be able to have the best stuff. So there is something sort of instinctive about wanting your tribe to be superior to others. And it really came to a point where the Nazis decided to kill anyone who was not part of their tribe, because they really thought that the best thing for humankind, since they were so convinced, and we're going to get into why this is wrong in a second, but they were so convinced that the best, the purest human beings were Aryans, were white non-Jews, that it would actually be a very big service to mankind to kill Jews. I presume they would have ended up killing, everyone who wasn't an Aryan. I mean, that was like the long game, but it seemed like they had a particular bone to pick with the Jews. I think the reason why Germans, and not Germans, is really Nazis, had a particular bone to pick with the Jews is they consider them to be the biggest threat. Just if you looked at Jews at that time, anyone from Albert Einstein to really anyone who, just in terms of like scientific innovation and inventions and sort of just, monetary success, they didn't really look at that point in time as necessarily Asians or black people or Latinos or anyone like that to really be a threat to their Aryan superiority. They looked at the Jews as being the biggest threat, and that's why they were so obsessed with killing Jews that they even made peace with Japan, which I'm sure, again, the end game of Nazi Germany was going to be to betray Japan and really exterminate the world from all Asians, anyone basically whose skin was not white and was not of Aryan descent. I mean, it was a good intention. They really thought, I know it's really hard to say that the Nazis had good intentions, but I really think the propaganda did. Just because your intentions are good does not mean that your ideology is good or that your actions are good. So they had, I presume, the best of intentions. They really thought they were doing the best thing for humanity, but their ideology was really, really messed up, because instead of being reasonable, they were just being emotional. They were just basing their whole ideology based on this instinct of we are better than them, instead of actually being reasonable and really realizing that there's very, very little differentiation between a Jewish person and an Aryan person, between a black person and a white person. We're going to get more into that into part 5, is that's really going to be the solution to racism. When the United States of America was founded, the people actually owned slaves, and the justification for that is that people who have black skin are just not one of us. They're not part of our society, and therefore they don't receive the same civil protections and rights as people with white skin do. Another example, just to go through them quickly, are white supremacists or the KKK. The KKK used to be actually a violent organization that would go around killing people of color. Nowadays, they're mostly a peaceful organization. But the thing that they have in common, again, is this ideology that since we, people with white skin, are the supreme race, we shouldn't be letting people of color into the higher levels of government and into our sort of like higher society. They should be actually kept separate from people with white skin. Again, I do believe that the source of all of these sort of racist ideologies really does go back to this fear of the unknown and fear of people who look different, and that is the sort of justification to create a social hierarchy where one skin color is better than a different skin color. So let's get into part 4, and I've really basically covered this already by just merely by explaining what is the ideology of pro-racists. Let's talk about the ideology of anti-racism. And the key to knowing that is that the amount of DNA, if we're talking on a scientific level, let's actually be intelligent and deal with the facts. The differences between a white person and a black person, between any two human beings of different races, the amount of DNA that differentiates between them is so small. It's a little tiny bit which affects how much pigment does our skin make. There's a little bit of difference, of course, in bone structure, obviously, and average height. There's a little differences, but the amount, again, that is actually different is so little it's insignificant. And one of the biggest proofs biologically that there is actually no difference at all between people of different colors of skin is that any human being, and we're going to go with just human beings right now, can mate with someone of a different race and just as easily have children with them than they can of someone with their own race. And that is Mother Nature yelling and screaming to us that we are all the same. If a person goes and mates with an animal, sorry to bring this up, I know this is a little bit of a touchy subject. If someone goes and mates with an animal of a different species, there is no chance of them having a child with that because they are different species. Then, to make the differentiation between a human being and an ape and a chimpanzee and a shark and a fish and a bird and a kangaroo, that is a very wise, very good, biologically sound, scientific differentiation to make. To start making a difference between someone who is your color of skin and not is a really unintelligent thing to do. And again, we've explained why we are instinctively based on appearances. We go and we look, we use our eyes to really absorb a lot of information. And one of the things, if a person does not know anything about science, does not know anything about DNA, and doesn't know that people of other races exist, the first time they go and they see someone of a different race, they're going to say, whoa, that person looks so much different than anyone I've ever seen, than anything I'm familiar with. So again, that barbaric, unintelligent instinct says be racist. But once we go a little bit of intelligence, know a little bit of science, a little bit about what really makes us who we are and what makes us human beings, and we know that, again, we are really have completely compatible DNA with someone of a different race. Just based on sheer intelligence alone, we should not be racist and not differentiate between someone of our own race and someone else. Why are people actually have different skin pigments? There's been sort of a separation of society, people who stayed on the African continent. Really, everyone is from Africa originally, but people stayed on the African continent. The natural selection there did end up favoring people with darker skin, and that's why they ended up being darker. People who were in Europe for whatever reason, I don't really know why, but natural selection clearly favored people with a little bit lighter skin. That's why Europeans are lighter, and you can go around the world and explain exactly what the thing was. Whether that was a natural selection, there was some advantage of being that color because it makes you more resistant to the sun or makes you able to camouflage better than the snow, or maybe there was some sort of beauty standard so you can explain it sociologically. Whatever the reason was, there was some sort of natural selection which made that. But at the end of the day, just because natural selection has made people from different parts of the world look a little bit different, once again, we are using our intelligence and being smart about it. There is really no difference between people of different races, which gets really, really nice. It makes really, really nicely into part 5 is what is the actual solution of racism? Now, The solution to racism is not merely yelling racism. Oh, that's racist. You're being yelling at people and antagonizing them, even for being racist, and even if they're genuinely racist. Let's forget about all the people that are falsely accusing. Someone makes a joke and you accuse them of being racist, of having some kind of racist ideology. But even a genuine race, if you would go to someone in the Ku Klux Klan and you would say, you're a racist, you're horrible, you're evil, you're not going to solve anything. No problem in the world has ever been solved by going and saying, no, 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 no. What you're going to end up doing if you yell at people is they're going to maintain their, first of all, they're going to get defensive. So they're probably going to believe whatever they believe even more. If you go and you antagonize a person being racist and you just say you're a bad person, they're probably going to end up being defensive and actually sort of fortify themselves in that belief and go and say, oh, I'm actually doing the right thing. And you guys don't even know what you're talking about. That's a natural instinct of people to be defensive. So, but for sure, you're not going to, by yelling at a person and attacking them, change their mind. And the idea in order to solve racism really is to change people's mind, which is a very simple thing. It's just education. Explaining to people how it works biologically in terms of our DNA, what a tiny part of our DNA really makes up the different colors of different people's skin, and why, even though, let's say, different countries in the world have different cultures, it is cultures do make people different. The society you're raised in makes people different, but that has nothing to do the people's culture has nothing to do with the color of their skin. Some people make this mistake for they go and they say, well, if you're black, you have to act black. Yeah, if you go and you don't talk in a certain way or dress in a certain way or act a certain way, you're doing something wrong because you're not being black enough and everything else too. So you're not Jewish enough, you're not white enough, you're not being Latino enough, whatever the thing is that's a huge mistake. I mean, it's such an unintelligent thing to say. The way a person acts, and those again are all cultural phenomena, of the way a person dresses and the way they talk and what accent they have, etc. Those are all things that are society based. Those are based on our surroundings. We as human beings, all of us are exactly the same, that we adapt to our surroundings, and when we live in different places, there ends up being forming different societies. But it certainly is horrible, a horrible thing to say, that a person, because of the color of their skin, must conform to a certain culture. In fact, that's actually a very racist thing to say, is to say that you're not acting black enough, you're not acting white enough, because basically you are then saying, what are you implying? You're implying because of the person's skin, they must act in a certain way, which means you are limiting the options that they have, the opinions that they could have, let's say even politically. You say, well, if you're of a certain race, you have to vote a certain way. You're basically saying that they do not have the ability, like other people, to decide between one or the other. They have to only have a very limited point of view. That's actually racism. That's actually pure racism, because you are implying that people of a certain race can only have a limited point of view, which is, I think, really implying that they're less intelligent. And of course is extremely wrong. This was really bothering me. Most of the anti-racist activists are not doing it in a reasonable way. It's just the fact nowadays. And there's a very logical explanation why most people who are anti-racist, who are really passionate about it, they're usually very angry. It's usually, if a person is going to be an activist, they have to have a reason, especially if a person's going to be putting themselves out there in harm's way, which I am. I know I am right now. I know people are going to hear me say these things. They're going to misquote me. They're going to come and say, oh, Fry, you're saying you're justifying being racist, because they're only going to just take a segment out of part 2 and 3 of this podcast, and they're going to completely misquote. I am putting myself in harm's way. In order for a person to put themselves in harm's way and go and confront people and really say, your ideology is wrong, and let me explain why, the person has to have a reason. And the main reason that makes people risk it all in order to do that is a trauma. They have suffered because of something, and a person who suffers because of racism is much more likely, or knows someone or loves someone who suffers because of racism, is much more likely to end up becoming an anti-racist activist. The SJWs and the people who are yelling, oh, that's racist, and get very angry, they play an important role. I'm not against them. I don't think that they have the solutions to racism. They certainly do not, because it's not being done in a rational way. But they're definitely an ally, because the great thing about social justice warriors, they're very good. They're very, very good at creating awareness of things. And I don't even know if I would necessarily be aware in terms of how much people suffer from racism in the world if it weren't for the SJWs. They make that noise. They express emotionally and passionately through pain and through suffering. They express what are the problems in the world. Now, again, you can't solve a problem through expressing pain. It doesn't solve anything. If you yell and you attack someone who is attacking you, unless you kill them all, again, unless you become the Nazi and you kill everyone who's attacking you, and you literally exterminate every single person or subdue them somehow. You basically, knock them into submission, every single person who disagrees with you. Unless you become a fascist, you're never going to be able to solve anything through force. The way that you're actually going to persuade people to your ideology is through reason, and that's really the whole reason why I'm making this channel. If you just look at anti-racist activism, just in the history of the United States alone, what has made the difference? Has it been riots? There's been a lot of riots. There's been a lot of destruction. Do you think those really have made people less racist? I think it's probably made people more racist, because when people, again, are threatened, they usually reinforce their ideology. The reason why America has become less, I'm not saying the problem is gone, but the reason why America has become less racist in the last 70 years or whatever it is because of reason. Is because people like Martin Luther King, which I've quoted a couple times already, saying that you need to judge, and this is every American heard this, you need to start judging people based on the content of their character. I'm paraphrasing. Judge people based on the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And that is a statement that all of America heard, and everyone who heard that says, wow, that makes sense. That's rational. That is a really rational thing. Whenever you explain it to a person that way, they're going to say, yeah, it actually does make sense that a person should be judged more. It matters more what's inside a person's heart, but the content of their character, what they do, rather than what is just on the outside. Now, my reason for coming out like this and really talking about this is actually not because I've suffered tremendously traumatized from racism. Now, I have experienced, we can call it racism or anti-Semitism because I'm Jewish. I've had literally full drinks of cola thrown at me out of the windows of cars. I've had threats of violence. I've been insulted. I've had all kinds of things. I'm not going to say these were the most traumatic experiences, but I've definitely have experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in my life. I think a lot of people, a lot of Jews are, but that's not the actual thing that's motivating me. And I'm sure the amount that I've suffered from anti-Semitism is not even comparable to the amount of a lot of people have actually suffered either from anti-Semitism or from racism. The thing that really motivates me to come out and talk about this, and really talk about any of these meaningful subjects, is that I've suffered from people being unreasonable. I think that if the Nazis, with all their ideology, if only they had been reasonable and scientific, and instead of listening to their hearts and their emotions and their instincts, they would have actually used their minds, they wouldn't have done any of that stuff. And I think every war in the world, if you have two countries essentially who have different interests and different opinions, and end up going to war over it, those wars would not be started if people would get their heads out of their tuchuses and really try to understand where another person is coming from and try to actually be reasonable instead of just going with whatever their natural instinct is. If you have instinctive lions, they're going to fight with each other. Once you have intelligent human beings, that's really embracing our intelligence and our reasonability rather than our instincts, and using our reason to make our decisions. That's really the thing that will actually create peace. I think I've suffered a lot from people being super unreasonable. I'm sure in some way, really anyone who's listening to this, you have probably suffered from people being unreasonable. You can definitely think if only that person had just really been rational. That is one of the things that really prevents most immoral behavior. Irrationality and people acting out of severe trauma and mental illness. I would say those are the two things that would really solve basically every problem in the world. So one thing we need to do is try to educate people to use their rational minds to make their decisions rather than just their instincts. And the second is actually work actively towards maintaining better mental health, which I will definitely talk a lot about. It's one of actually the main focuses of this podcast. I definitely want to talk about common mental health issues and traumas and things that people experience that make them be less rational, and how one can actually move past that and become a rational person despite those experiences. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope this was informative. If you think that there is a different definition of racism that I sort of missed and I overlooked, or if you really disagree with anything that I've said, please leave in the comment section below. I really do want to hear what the other opinions, what people who disagree with me have to say. I really think that that is not only an important thing for staying informed, but really just to be intellectually honest. You really need to take what other people say seriously and really consider what they say. If you have any topics that you would like me, as particularly controversial topics, things that there's a lot of opinions about, things that are hard to understand, that you would like me to talk about in future podcasts, let me know in the comment section below. I will be paying close attention and will definitely want to try to cover topics that a lot of people would like to see. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Peace. This is Fry.